I wanted to thank you for joining our community as we discuss the life and legacy of your father, Elie Wiesel. This evening's discussion, in which we will explore optimism, mutual understanding, and compassion, seems so urgent and necessary in today's political and social climate. We look forward to learning from your father through your eyes, his son. So to begin, for the benefit of those in a diverse audience, some of whom may not be so familiar with your father, can you give us a brief overview of the life of Elie Wiesel?
Wow, we're not starting with a small question. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Rebitz and Rivka. I want to say thanks to Rob Block for having me here together with you for this incredible event for Chabad Plano. I hope to shed some light and do what I can. My father was born in the late 1920s in a small town called Sziget, which had gone back and forth between Romania and Hungary, several times as different wars set the landscape differently. His grandfather had been actually killed in action as a medic in World War I, fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father, Shlomo Wiesel, was a shopkeeper. They owned a small, grocery store. And my grandfather was a man who was very active in the community, really a leader in Sziget. My grandmother, Sarah Wiesel, was, I think, she was the Vizhnitz connection. Her father, Dodja Feig, was the farmer who would really get my father more deeply immersed into Hasidism. So he had these different connections. He had the more urban world of his father. He had the more Hasidish, rural world that came from his mother's side. It's his mother who would take him to see the Vizhnitz Rebbe when he would visit. So he had both of those influences growing up. And my father, really until the age of 14 when the war came, for him life was about studying. He wanted to study Kabbalah. That's what he really wanted. He couldn't wait to get straight into Jewish mysticism, and he would engage in all sorts of activities that his father would say, don't you dare let me catch you doing these things. You are not to sit there and fast in order to try to see angels. You are not to go roll in the snow. But my father had a real mystical orientation, and he was always looking for what was behind everything else that he was being taught.
How old was your father during the Holocaust?
He was a teenager. My father was born in 1928. So, they were sent to Auschwitz in 1944. So he was almost 16.
Almost 16. And when he came to America, how old was he?
He came to America, I think, really in his 30s. Maybe even late 20s. He had gone to France. He was one of the boys of Buchenwald who, after liberation, went to something called the OSE, which was effectively a rescue organization that put many of these victims, these children, into orphanages in France. And that's where he was sort of first found by the JDC, when our good friend Ted Comet went there to look for him. And ultimately, my father then went on to the Sorbonne, where he studied humanities. And it was in France that he met and encountered Francois Mauriac, who had encouraged him to tell his story. But really, my father didn't come to the United States until later, when he was a journalist already. And my father was covering the United Nations for Yediot Achronot, and he was also working for the Vorwärts at that time, for the Yiddish newspaper. And really, he was there on, as a journalist, as an employee. And the way that my father ended up staying in the United States is really an amazing tale, especially when you think about it in the modern context of how we've been viewing immigrants. My father had been hit by a taxi in the 1950s. I think it dragged him half a block. It was a terrible injury. He'd been taken by ambulance to 4 different hospitals, but nobody wanted him because he didn't have insurance and couldn't pay for anything. But finally they found a hospital, and he was in a full body cast for weeks and weeks. And I think because of that, he missed his appointment to renew his visa. And I think he went to, my father's always been scared of officials, which makes sense, I think, if you understand his background. But he went very nervous to the immigration office, to the customs office, and talked about renewing his visa. And this kind customs officer looked at him and said, you can apply for citizenship. That's a thing one can do. amazing, right? To think about that in today's day and age. The idea of a customs officer warmly saying, you can become a citizen of this country. And my father likes to say the United States is the country that offered him home. He'd been without a state really since World War II, since the Holocaust. And the United States was the country that offered him citizenship and enabled him to no longer be a stateless person. So he had deep love for this country.
As a parent myself, I often think about the burden of expectations, the unspoken ones that we intentionally and even inadvertently place on our children, and how that forms them into the adults that they become. As the only child of a survivor of the Holocaust, and one as well known on the world stage as your father, your childhood was most certainly not typical. Looking back at your childhood with the eyes of an adult, how were you impacted by the unique childhood you had? And secondly, how does that experience guide your parenting of your own two children?
It's a great question. Thank you, Rivka. I think my father was keenly aware of the burden that he was placing on me in being the only son, not just of a prominent Holocaust survivor, but the only son of the only son who remained from the Wiesel family. I think there was a sense that he felt the weight on me, and he was always very careful to try to lessen the weight. He never sat me down at any moment in time to say, okay, now I want to tell you the whole story of what happened. Not that I can remember. Most of what I learned about Holocaust memory and my family was more absorbed in an ambient fashion through the trips we took, through the people who came and engaged my family in conversation, through the business that I saw he had at hand, traveling in the 1970s to visit President Carter and discuss the United States Holocaust Commission, the discussions of the creation of the museum, trips abroad to the camps, delegations. These are the things that I remember growing up when many other kids my age were playing baseball or were heading to Miami Beach or were heading, to go skiing. These were the sorts of places that I was going with my family. So there was a lot to pick up in an ambient fashion. And my father, I think, felt very strongly this danger of all of this memory becoming a burden, so he sought to protect me from it and do what he could to lessen it. In terms of what that's done and meant to me for my own parenting, I think that I have tried to pivot and say the issue is not Holocaust memory. We've discussed it. I took my son, who is now 15, I guess shortly after his bar mitzvah, I took him to Seagate. I took him to Poland. I wanted him to see. I thought it was important. But most of my dialogue with him as a parent, I think, is a little bit different. The focus is to put joy at the forefront of his Jewish experience. And he doesn't go to a Jewish day school. My daughter does. And I thought long and hard about how important it was to give him that choice. He made the choice to go to a more science-oriented school. And I said, my opportunity to pass on Jewish values and Jewish connection is going to be what I do in the home. This is it. This is what it all comes down to. And by the way, it's what it came down to even when I was in school, although I went to a Jewish day school for 14 years. And for us, for me, I find tremendous meaning in davening with my son every day. Because he doesn't go to a day school, there's no minyan where he goes. So he and I daven together. We put on tefillin together every morning before he walks out the door. If I grew up in a home where we would sing Shalom Aleichem at the Friday night dinner table, and then there would be kiddush and candles, but that was kind of it in terms of Yiddishkeit. For me, the Shabbos dinner table, if we sang Shalom Aleichem growing up, I want to sing Eshes Chayil as well. If my father's dinner table and my mother's dinner table was characterized by a very secular salon feel, we always had very high-powered intellectuals, journalists, world ambassadors coming through. I want my kids to remember that at the end of every Shabbos Friday night dinner, we sing the entire benching, and we don't miss a word. And there's joy, and there's love, and there's a sense of boisterousness and stories to tell, and everybody has something they want to get in and their ideas to exchange. My kids are going to remember that way, way more than whether they memorized the first, couple of lines of Baba Metzia, of a Talmudic passage. So that's been my approach into what it is. I don't push the Holocaust memory aggressively. When they have questions or they're curious, I engage with them on it. But the thing that I want them most to remember is that there is a Judaism that the Holocaust attacked. And it is the Judaism and our culture and our tradition and our connection to thousands of years that's what's valuable. And we have to invest in making that joyful and experiential and something that they will taste and smell and feel. And someday when they have to make the decision, which they inevitably will, of are they going to date outside the faith? Are they going to consider marrying outside the faith? It's going to be more than any lecture I gave them about the Shoah or a story that I told them. It's going to be those feelings and impressions from around the Shabbos dinner table that I think are going to keep them on the path of perpetuating our family and our people.
It's interesting to me, the idea, the image I have of you being an only child to older parents, if I understand correctly, and with the history of your father, there's a certain, preciousness, and with that comes with that incredible, like, the importance that you played in their life, and how significant you are is felt very differently, I'm sure, than even with your own two children, where they have somewhat more of a normal, you could say, upbringing, where most of their parents are probably you and your wife's age, and they're probably a lot more similar. But I think that there's something the image is so beautiful to me of this is a picture of your father laying on a bed. He's wearing a white sweater and you are laying your baby. You must be like 4 months old. And it's like that little baby must have represented so much to your father. It's just a beautiful picture.
I appreciate you sharing that, but make no mistake, my grandchildren were, I think, as important, ultimately, if not more, to my father.
It's true.
Look, whatever else I do in life from here on in, whatever else I've done up until this point, I have one thing on my scorecard, which is I gave my father grandchildren that he got to spend many years with. So when I go up above and I have to talk to the judge who matters, that's something I always know. I have on the plus side of my score sheet, and they're just as precious to him, because if my existence is a triumph of my father having survived the Holocaust and survived that despair and finding the hope to continue and produce another generation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, then my children existing as Jewish children is also an accomplishment. It's the survival of the generation of assimilation. It would have been so easy to assimilate. There were so many moments in my own life where, despite everything my father went through, I was very close to turning my back on Judaism, on Yiddishkeit, on any semblance of observance or connection, and saying the whole thing doesn't make sense. But I didn't. And that too is a miracle of survival, of Jewish survival, that was profoundly important to my father. I said I would talk a little bit about the significance of what it meant that I was born at all. My father did not want to have children after the war. It was very clear to him. He had a phrase. He said, "The world does not deserve more Jewish children." And to get him off of that opinion really required three people in a persistent, concerted effort. The first was his teacher, Rav Saul Lieberman, who was always on him, when are you going to get married? The second was actually the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I found beautiful letters after my father's passing in his drawer, over the course of years, with the Rebbe writing my father and always starting, basically saying, "Nu, are you married yet? When are you going to get married? The way to fight Hitler and all of those who would support him is to have Jewish children and grandchildren." And he said in one of those letters, and even if those children and grandchildren grow up to be Vishnitz Hasidim instead of Lubavitch Hasidim, it's still okay with me. What matters is that you should continue. And of course, the third person is my mother, maybe obviously the most influential to convince him to have children. So in some sense, my existence is a triumph over despair. And obviously I give incredible thanks to my father for deciding to take a chance on me, to take a chance on the world, and to give me life.
In many of your conversations that you've had, you talk about your very openly. You speak about your period of rebelliousness that you had as an adolescent and a young adult. Can you share how your father responded to you during that time, and what kind of a lesson do you think we can learn, not only as parents, but also in meeting people who don't agree or live the way that we imagine they should?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Rivka. I think when it comes to my father, I really feel like there's two sets of Torah. There's the Torah shebichtav, there's the written Torah, there's the works that he produced, his testimony as a witness, what he saw in the camps, the writings that he had to tell about Hasidism and what it meant to him, his stories more broadly. There's a written testimony from my father that he never wanted anybody to get between. He always wanted the reader to experience it directly. But there's also the Torah Shebe'al Peh. There's the oral tradition of those who knew my father. And those who knew my father, I think, will tell of how he was an incredible, remarkable human being who was always empathetic, always had time. Even if he had phone calls with world leaders or business leaders or heads of state, if the taxi driver from Bangladesh wanted to talk to him about his children and what he was experiencing, my father listened. He wanted to acknowledge the speaker. He wanted to hear the story. If his hairdresser wanted to distract him 20 minutes longer, even after his appointment was done and he could go home, my father would stay. He would listen. When he would speak at the 92nd Street Y and 40 people would line up, my father would not go until he'd had a chance to make eye contact with everyone, shake their hand, hear their story. And with me growing up, my father obviously didn't agree with many of the choices that I was making, but his response of loving me no matter what, and welcoming me home with open arms, and always searching for common ground, something that the two of us could talk about together, the way in which he did it spoke more than any argument he might make about the values he wanted to bring me back to, whether they were values of Judaism or otherwise. His actions, he led by example. And to be near him was to be inspired to become a gentler, warmer, more empathetic person oneself. And that's the way he taught, just by being. And it's a very powerful message. We're in a world today where, whether it's social media, whether it's political leaders, whether it's journalism more broadly, we're always being provoked to distrust somebody who disagrees with us. Can you believe what this person said? Can you believe what this person did? And it's getting worse and worse and worse. I believe we can turn the corner. I think it's possible to begin listening to each other again. I don't think that people I disagree with have completely different values from me, even if you voted differently. I did a lot of research and thinking about this over the past year. I think people prioritize different values, but that's of course what people are going to do. For some people, it's going to be more important to preserve their concept of a family. For others, it's more important to preserve the concept of individual liberty and self-expression. But these two things don't have to be in conflict. People prioritize them differently, and often there are ways to bring them together, and often we discover that we actually want the same things if we're willing to get past the sound bites and listen. So that's something very much that I hope we can do as a country, and I believe we can.
You tell of a conversation you had with your father during your self-described rebellious years. You asked your father, and I paraphrase, "What is more important, being a good Jew or a good person?" Can you please share your father's answer and its relevance to us today, especially in light of the steady decline in religious participation by young people in virtually every major religion?
I think questions of that nature obviously were provocative. If I asked my father what's more important, to be a good Jew or a good human being, there's obviously an agenda behind that question. I'm trying to provoke something. And the amazing thing about my father is he would not be provoked. Very calmly, he would explain, there is no contradiction. For my father, to be a good human being meant to be a good Jew. And to be a good Jew meant to be a good human being. My father felt it was very important to know where one came from, and that would give one great insight into where one was going. And he felt that Jewish values dictated he had to have a very broad net, and that he had to interact and find ways to listen to and contribute to the life of a world that had many non-Jews in it. And similarly, he felt that with everything he was learning, with all of the engagements and travels through different ideas that he had, that he could make a more rich Jewish experience for himself by bringing these things back in. So there was no conflict, and he was very clear. You might as well try to split an atomic particle. Like, this is not something that one can do. And I see these false choices presented all the time. I see the false choice of, should one be a progressive in the modern political environment and support social justice, rights for LGBTQ, have concern for human rights issues abroad, or should one be a strong Zionist? What a terrible, provocative question. Why does one have to choose? But there are enemies. We have enemies that would seek to divide us in that way, because there's an agenda behind the provocation, and we can't let ourselves be divided.
So, can you draw from your father's wisdom and outlook on life as to what might be contributing today to our increasing unwillingness to hear each other, and what decisions as individuals can we take to help heal our country and world?
It's hard to know the right answers. It's hard to know exactly what part of my father's wisdom to draw from. On the one hand, my father said, indifference is the enemy, right? Indifference is worse than hate. It means you're dead inside to the needs of your fellow man. And I think my father is right, and I think it's appropriate that he is quoted on this as often as he is. We need to be awakened to the needs of those around us. On the other hand, it feels like we're at a time where we've never been less indifferent. Everybody has an opinion. We're shouting at each other, and we're all convinced that we have the right moral values that are driving our viewpoints, and that therefore the other person is wrong. So we've somehow gone all the way from indifference to shouting, and we missed in the middle listening, thinking, exchanging ideas, discussing, giving each other the benefit of the doubt. My father gave the benefit of the doubt to people that frankly surprised me sometimes, his ability to do that. Look, my father had lines, don't get me wrong. Holocaust deniers, people who were committed to the destruction of the state of Israel, whether it's physical destruction or it's destruction as our Jewish state and our Jewish homeland. There were certain lines beyond which he felt you couldn't engage with people. But for the most part, across different political bents, different priorities, people who came from different backgrounds, my father believed very much in the power of dialogue. My father believed that that was what it meant to have peaceful evolution of ideas and of policy. So when I think about what we need, I'll tell you what I've chosen to do for myself. And again, I'm not saying it's the right thing for everyone, but if you ask me how I think about it, I reached a point a few months ago where I decided that for conversations about politics, I was going to stop measuring my success as to whether or not I convinced the person I was speaking to of anything, or whether I got them to read a book or an article. And instead, I set up a very simple metric, and I've started keeping count and score. Do I leave the conversation feeling closer to the other person, and do they leave feeling closer to me? And if I've achieved that, I've already started to dig myself, at least, out of the hole. And I want to speak to people who think differently. I am curious, I'm infinitely curious about how people get to completely different policy conclusions than I do. And I want to understand. And if I talk to enough people, maybe my own view will change. And maybe that's not a bad thing. And on the other hand, if in those conversations I present myself as being open, which I truly am, and curious, which I truly am, about what makes people tick and the kind of thinking they've done on their positions, maybe that will in turn have an impression on them that if I come from a different place, I'm not the enemy. I'm just a fellow citizen, a fellow person on this planet, trying to understand what the right thing is to do.
I think that so many people just need to be heard and just have to listen to them and not, I think, we tend to, in the political arena over social media, there's the unfollow button and the follow button, and the harshness of the rhetoric is so much that the other person doesn't even feel heard and seen. And I have a preschool here in Plano, and I noticed that with children as young as 3 years old, when they have a problem and they're upset, so often all they need is for you to listen to them, and they have to just share with you why they're upset and what's bothering them. And you don't need to solve the problem for them, and you don't need to show them a better way of doing things. You just need to hear them. And I think that perhaps that is one of the biggest problems that our country is facing, or the world is facing, is that with social media, you don't have that opportunity, like that you speak about, having a conversation with someone. You don't have that opportunity to really have a face-to-face, especially not with COVID, conversation with someone who does not, who believes differently than you, perhaps, and we don't give them the opportunity or have that opportunity to actually listen to them.
It's hard. We're operating in a world where we're struggling to create shared experience, which is what we do as communities and as friends and as partners. If you think about the people you're close to, you're continually creating a shared experience that you can go back to and draw on. And when we're all living electronically, the quality of that shared experience is low. The interactions are lower. We have to do what we can. I intentionally, in my newsfeed, prioritize people that I disagree with the most. And sometimes I find the way they behave makes me want to cringe because they are snarky or sarcastic, or they're biting and they're ridiculing, in effect, me or people who hold positions like me. On the other hand, occasionally, every so often, they make an excellent point, and I say, wow, I'm really glad I paid attention and was able to understand where they're coming from a little bit more. What am I doing to challenge my own thinking? If like me, I feel a certain way on an issue, what am I doing where within the confines of that issue, there's room for compassion for the other side, or there's room to think about something differently? And I can't say I always get it right. I can't say that these thoughts lead to action as much as I would like them to lead, but I feel like I'm on the right track. Even if I'm not moving quickly enough, I do feel I'm on the right track.
So one of the other qualities I think that we wanted to explore tonight is also that of resiliency and optimism. And your father, after the Holocaust, like you mentioned earlier, he did not want to get married and certainly did not want to have children. And yet he did. And given the upheaval that COVID has wrought on our world, and the real pain and suffering that people are undergoing as a result of this, especially children and young, adolescents and teenagers, what lesson in resiliency, words of wisdom that your father, in his decision to have a child, that resiliency and optimism, how do you translate that into your life, and how do you maybe suggest that people cultivate that in themselves and pass it on to their children?
It's very interesting. There have been all these psychological studies that if you want to develop, warm feelings between people, give people the opportunity to praise each other. The more you engage in positive acts to one another, if you do something nice for someone, even if it's staged, even if it's something that was created artificially, the mere act of doing it makes you want to do it a second time, because guess what? You feel good when you say something good to someone else. There's something that is self-reinforcing about these sorts of positive behaviors. Look at our people. Look at everything the Jewish people has been through. How is it possible that we've kept our culture together? We've kept our traditions together. We have a sense of values. We know what's at the bedrock of our beliefs. And yet, on the other hand, we change and we evolve. The poskim, the tshuva, the modernity comes at us, and we find ways to grapple with it and evolve without losing sight of who we are or where we came from. How do we do it? Well, think about what we do every day. Think about what we do when we go to shul. Think about what we do when we wake up in the morning, and the very first thing we do is we do the Birchot HaShachar. We give thanks. That's what we do. Gratitude, my father believed, is the soul of Judaism. That's what it means. That to be Yehudi, to be a Jew, means to be someone who is capable of feeling gratitude. And the prayers that we go through, where we give thanks to Hashem, where we, even if we don't feel it in that moment, we go through the exercise and we remind ourselves of everything that we have to be grateful for. Even when it seems down, even when we're not feeling it, there is always something to be grateful for. And that looking for positivity, that sense of what we've been given in this life is a gift. And if everything's not always going our way, well, guess what? What did we pay for this life? It was given to us for free. And it comes as a responsibility. We're supposed to do something with it. And for me, that starts with a sense of gratitude, and I think from gratitude to joy, and from joy to purpose. And I think that that's very much at the heart of why what we have in Judaism is not something to lose, not to those who hate us, not to assimilation and the disappearance of Jewish observance and literacy and practice. If we can remember this concept of gratitude that is at the center of who we are, I think we're going to be here for another 4,000 years and longer.
Absolutely, with Hashem's help. It's clear that your father took his experience from the Holocaust as a survivor, and he became the voice not only for the Holocaust and the memories of the Holocaust for the world, but he also became the voice for standing up for all people who suffered injustices and genocides around the world. What do you think motivated your father to dedicate his life to public service, unlike most other survivors who chose to live private lives?
First of all, I have to say that any survivor who came out of what they experienced and made the decision to keep on living, and in many cases have families, and in many cases have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, or write their stories, or open a shop, or plant a garden, or really do anything, any one of those people deserves our unending admiration and respect. We will never understand what they went through. For my father, I think he always saw his father watching him. And he always had this question in his mind of, I was lucky. I wasn't stronger. I wasn't smarter. I wasn't figuring out how to make trades or organize or find some way to curry favor. My father felt he was just simply lucky. There was no reason that he had been chosen. So what was he going to do with this life that he had been given? And at the end of his days, when he was reunited with his parents and his family, and when he was standing before Kadosh Baruch Hu, and he was standing before God, what account was he going to give of these years he'd been given?
You tell how the obligation to pray for your father's soul, known as the Kaddish, following the passing of your father, was in fact a great gift that your father gave you. Can you share about your personal journey of Jewish observance that began during this year of mourning, and the importance for all of us for continual growth?
Listen, my journey of Jewish observance didn't necessarily begin with saying Kaddish for my father. And it's true what you say. When my father only gave me 2 guidelines in life. The first, as I said earlier, is he said, you have to marry Jewish. It's okay if someone converts if it's, a conversion kehalacha. But if they're Reform, conservative, Orthodox, doesn't matter, but you have to marry Jewish. And he said, this is the one line you cannot cross in our relationship. The second thing he asked me later, when already he was sick with cancer, and it was an uncomfortable conversation for me because I wanted to tell him he was wrong, we didn't have to think about this. He said, Elisha, I want you to say Kaddish for me. And I expect you to do it right. I would like you to go every day. And At first I thought that he was asking me to do a favor for him because it mattered to him spiritually that this occur. And I really only realized once it was underway that it was actually his last gift for me. I had been moving, I think, towards observance as I went through some of the important life stages. I think that when I held my own son in my hands at his bris, and I felt the connection going back thousands of years, for the first time I saw it as a parent. I think to experience Judaism without children, one can be grateful for it, one can enjoy it, one can appreciate it and be immersed in it. But until all of a sudden the choice is in your hands, are you going to continue this thing that we have or not? It really becomes a choice that comes into clear relief the moment you have your children and their education unfolding in front of you. And when my son was born, everything changed, as I think it does for most new parents. And the year of Kaddish brought me closer. All of a sudden I realized that, like my father, I had a passport into every corner of the Jewish world. And no matter where I went, I had a role to play as a mourner saying Kaddish. It's as though they were waiting for me. There was a moment in the service when it was expected for me to add my voice to praising God. And different shuls gave me different pieces. The shul that is, a block from me, West Side Institutional Synagogue, was such a warm and inviting place for the weekday morning minyan. At my work, at Goldman Sachs, where I worked for 25 years, I'd never understood or appreciated that there was a minyan that met for Shachris, Mincha, Maariv every day, and that all of a sudden it was possible for me to not have to pause my high-powered career, that in fact I could take a break, I could go to Mincha, and it could be part of my day. It didn't have to block it. It didn't have to disrupt it. Being able to go to the Karlbach Shul and hear the amazing nigunim that Rav Shlomo had created and that are kept on through his inheritance, through his inheritors, through Rav Naftali Citron. Unbelievable to discover how powerful and profound joy had a place in observance. I hadn't understood that. And of course, when I went to Chabad, the very first Shabbos after my father had passed, and I found my way in and I sat down and I heard the nigunim being sung and I saw, it seemed to me almost in the first time in my life, although it wasn't true because I had changed, not the people around me, but I saw for the first time what it meant to have a minyan of other Jews truly there because they belonged, because they loved it, because it was not a chore, but something that gave to them as much as they gave to it. So I had this passport all around the world, and wherever I traveled, I was finding minyanim, whether that was in London or in Israel or in Poland. We always found a way to put together minyanim and keep my Kaddish year going. And that was an incredible experience. And Chabad facilitated so many of those Kaddish moments, I can't tell you, and I'm deeply appreciative.
So can you share your thoughts on the Chabad shuls and Chabad houses that you've gone to, and what the Chabad emissaries, what they've maybe how they've inspired you, or how you've seen Jewish life a little bit differently after having met them?
Of course, I'd say that very few institutions have had the impact on my understanding of Judaism as Chabad has. It is, it was at a Chabad rabbi's house that I first saw the power of having a big family and what it means to have a Shabbos dinner table that is overflowing with l'chaims and with discussion and with curiosity and with love. People coming in and out, back and forth to the table, a meal that seems like it goes on forever, a Rav who holds court and makes sure everyone is included, a Rebbitzin who exudes warmth. I saw this at so many different dinner tables. I saw this, with my dear friend Rav Shmuley here in New York. I've seen it, at the Darrens in Greenwich, Connecticut. Everywhere I've gone, people who either are currently Chabad or grew up in Chabad, the sense of passion and joy and music, and that Yiddishkeit is a gift, and it's one to be fully celebrated and immersed in. And it's been tremendous for me. I have nothing but praise for Chabad, and that's why when Chabad calls, I almost never say no. I'm not going to say I didn't have the opportunity to meet the Rebbe. I'm sure I did. If I'd been more interested in Yiddishkeit, if I hadn't conveyed through my body language and words to my father that I was so profoundly uninterested in things Jewish, I probably would have had the opportunity to meet the Rebbe, because my father met him often. But I can tell you that even though I haven't met him, I can sense what an amazing man he was, because with all of the shluchim and Chabad Hasidim that I've met in my travels, and I feel like they're all one family. I feel like these are all the children of the Rebbe that he never had himself. And you can sometimes see when you talk to the children of someone, and you speak to enough of them, and you see what they have in common, you get a sense of who the man was, and of course his wife as well, the Rebbitzin, who these people were that created a community with such strong values and respect and care and openness. And you can only think, wow, what must the man himself have been like? Rav Block, Rebbitzin Block, thank you for inviting me to be part of this evening. My father accomplished one of the hardest things to do in life, to be deeply rooted in one's own identity, and also to reach out unflinchingly to the broader world. My father felt very passionately that everything he did on the world stage, he did as a Jew. And yet he felt that it was because he was a Jew that he had to engage on the world stage and not avert his eyes when there were people in need. Chabad is a religious organization, and its mission is something that I agree with deeply. The Lubavitcher Rebbe always wanted a Jew to do one more mitzvah, one more good deed, one more step closer to God, one more step closer to one's fellow man. And although it's a religious organization oriented towards Jews, I think that it resonates very much with my father. Because when I would discuss religion with my father and ask him what he wanted for me and why, he would say, for myself, I want to be a good Jew, and that's what I want for you, my son. But for someone I meet who is Christian, I want them to be a good Christian too. I have hopes and dreams for them. And if I meet someone who is a Muslim, I want them to be a good Muslim. And if I meet someone who is a committed atheist, let them be the best atheist they can be. He wanted people to be true to themselves and to find a way to be the best version of themselves, no matter who they were or what they did. He felt that way about people who were LGBTQ, or of a different skin color, or a different background, a different faith, a different persuasion. And when I think about the world today and what messages we need to hear, with so much shouting at each other, so much provocation, we need more voices that want each other to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be, whether we disagree or not. I want my opponent, if he's going to disagree with me, I want him to have the best possible argument, not the weakest. I want it to be the best thought out. I want to be able to understand the values that drive it, and for my opponent to understand mine. And I think there's a call to action here for us to think about when we think about my father, when we think about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who is one of the Rebbes of Chabad, one of the great Rebbes of Chabad. And it's a call to action both in terms of how we treat each other and what we do with this amazing time, this gift that we've been given that is our lives. Are we paying attention and hearing what's happening? And can we compel each other to do something about it without always criticizing or provoking? I'll give you an example. Millions of Uyghurs, Muslims in China, are being imprisoned simply for their faith and ethnicity. Some might come to you and say, how come you're not doing something about that? You're talking about one set of moral values and you're talking about your issue. Well, why aren't you doing anything there? Immediately, provocation, it's instead of becoming a chance to help, it's become evidence of someone's character failings. Imagine what a difference if instead of using it as a point of criticism, one simply says, so what should we do to help? Open a door for participation. Extend the benefit of the doubt that the person across the table for you, if you open the door to them and extend them the chance to do something positive or constructive, that possibility might come to fruition. If you judge them or speak to them harshly or put them in a box, they may react the way you would if you were put there. And that's an incredibly hard lesson for us to absorb and learn without having gone through it. But we have gone through it. It's been years now where in this culture we've stopped extending the benefit of the doubt. Opportunities to help have instead become reasons for criticism. I know that my father, as someone who loved this country deeply, would very much want to see us move past this moment. And Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, with the chance to have a new beginning in this country, hopefully we can all get a little bit closer to that ideal. Thank you for inviting me tonight.
אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח ואף על פי שיתממך אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא.